All right, so today we're going deep on bonsai repotting. It might seem pretty simple, like just moving a plant to a bigger pot,
Right.
but it's actually a crucial part of keeping your bonsai healthy, helping it grow, and shaping it over time.
Repotting is kind of interesting, actually. You're disrupting the roots of a tree that, in nature, likes to grow undisturbed. But with bonsai, we're dealing with a container, so it changes things up.
Okay, so first things first, why is repotting even necessary?
Well, think about it. In nature, the roots spread out, right?
Yeah.
Looking for water, looking for nutrients. But in a pot, they hit the walls and start circling around. It's called root bound, and it's not good. And over time, a few things start to happen. The nutrients in the soil get used up.
Mm-hmm.
The roots grow and can become all tangled and crowded,
I see.
and the soil itself can become compacted, making it hard for the tree to get the water and air it needs. And that's where repotting comes in. It's like giving your bonsai a fresh start. You give it new soil, which
Yeah.
is packed with nutrients.
Okay.
You trim the roots, and it helps them grow those fine roots that are better at absorbing stuff. And you make sure the soil's nice and loose so the roots can breathe and absorb water easily.
So basically, repotting is essential for the bonsai's long-term health and, well, survival.
It is, yeah.
So how do we know when it's time to repot?
There's a few telltale signs that your bonsai's ready for a new home.
Okay.
One of the most obvious is if the roots are circling the inside of the pot or growing out of the drainage holes. That's a pretty clear sign that the roots have run out of space.
So they're trying to break free.
Exactly. And if the roots are actually pushing the tree up out of the soil, that's a really clear sign that it's time for a repot.
What about the soil itself?
If the soil becomes compacted and hard, it prevents water from penetrating properly. And you might also notice the topsoil looks depleted and lacks a healthy structure.
What about the tree's growth?
Stunted or slow growth can indicate a lack of nutrients or space for roots to grow.
Right.
Another thing to watch for is if the tree becomes top-heavy and unstable in its pot, that means the roots aren't able to anchor it properly.
So we've got the root-bound pots, compacted soil, and slow growth.
Mm-hmm.
What about the timing for repotting? Does that matter?
Timing is crucial. You know, when you repot a bonsai, you are going to cause some damage to the root system. But the goal is to minimize that damage and really give those roots the best chance to recover and thrive in their new environment. And it really depends on the type of bonsai you have.
Okay.
Early spring is the ideal time to repot both deciduous and evergreen bonsai, like just as you start to see the buds swelling.
Okay, so that makes sense for deciduous trees, right? They're kind of still dormant in early spring. They're not really putting a lot of energy into growing leaves or anything.
Exactly, yeah. They're in that resting phase, so they'll experience less stress from the repotting. And, you know, as the weather warms up and the tree starts growing again, any damage to the root system is going to be repaired pretty quickly.
Okay, I'm with you on deciduous trees, but, you know, evergreens don't really have that dormant period, do they? Why is early spring a good time for them?
Well, you're right. Evergreens, they don't go fully dormant, but they do experience a much slower growth period during the winter. And just like with deciduous trees, you know, as that new growth is about to emerge, early spring is kind of that sweet spot, you know, gives them a chance to recover and they can put all their energy into that new growth and minimize stress.
So both deciduous trees, those that lose their leaves in the fall, and evergreens, which keep their foliage year-round, they both benefit from early spring repotting.
Yeah, generally speaking, that's right. But there are a few exceptions, particularly for bonsai that flower in early spring, like forsythia and azaleas, for example.
Those are the ones with those vibrant blooms early in the season.
Yeah, exactly. With those species, we got to be a bit more careful about their flowering cycle. If you repot just before or during their peak flowering, you risk disrupting those delicate blooms.
Okay, so how do we figure out the best time to repot these early bloomers?
It's all about observing the tree's flowering patterns. If your azalea is showing signs of bud development, or if it's already starting to flower, it's best to wait. Hold off on repotting until after the flowering period's over. That way, the tree can put its energy into producing those beautiful blossoms without the added stress of being repotted.
Okay, now we've been talking about deciduous and evergreen, but what about tropical bonsai, like a ficus? You know, they don't really follow the same seasonal patterns.
Right. Tropical bonsai, they have their own rhythm and, you know, it's driven by warmth and humidity. You can be more flexible with indoor tropical trees.
Okay.
You can repot almost any time of year because the environment is so stable.
Right.
But best time to repot a tropical bonsai is in the middle of summer.
Okay, that seems counterintuitive. Why would we want to repot them when they're in their most active growth phase?
Because they're at their most vigorous during those hot, humid summer months, and they're used to that warmth, so the summer heat won't phase them. Plus, they're growing rapidly, so they can bounce back from root disturbance much faster than they would at other times of the year.
So they thrive on that summer energy.
They do.
Okay, now I'm guessing there are some times that we want to absolutely avoid repotting.
For outdoor bonsai, you want to avoid summer and winter.
Okay.
Yeah, think about the extremes of temperature during those seasons.
Yeah, I can see how repotting, in the heat of summer would add a lot of extra stress to a tree that's trying to recover.
Exactly.
And I imagine, the winter would be especially harsh on those roots if they were exposed.
Absolutely.
What about the health of the tree? Does that play a role in deciding whether or not to repot?
Absolutely. A weak bonsai is already under stress, right?
Yeah, it's struggling.
So repotting just adds another layer of stress on top of that, making it even harder for the tree to recover.
So instead of repotting, what should you do if you have a bonsai that's not doing so well?
The best approach is to focus on creating the ideal environment for it to regain strength. So proper watering, light, fertilizer, all the basics.
So basically just give it the best possible care and let it recover on its own.
Exactly. Once it's showing signs of vigorous growth, then you can reassess and see if a repot is truly necessary.
Got it. So we've covered wrong time of year and weak trees. What are some other situations where repotting might not be the best idea?
Well, think about bringing home a brand new bonsai. That tree has just gone through a major transition. It's been moved from its familiar environment, whether that's a nursery or a greenhouse, and now it's in your home.
So it's already dealing with a lot of change.
Exactly. New light, different humidity, maybe even temperature fluctuations. It's a lot for a tree to handle.
So repotting right away would just add more stress.
Exactly. Give your new bonsai time to acclimate to its new environment first, at least a few weeks or even a couple of months. Then you can think about repotting if it truly needs it.
Makes sense. What about Yamadori? I know those are bonsai collected from the wild. Do they have any special repotting considerations?
Definitely Yamadori have root systems that have adapted to thrive in their natural habitat out in the elements.
Right. So their roots are used to being in the ground, not in a pot.
Exactly. And they can be much more delicate than the roots of cultivated bonsai.
So going from the wild to a pot must be a huge shock to their system.
It can be. So with Yamadori, you want to be extra cautious. Give them plenty of time to adjust to their new confined environment before even considering repotting.
Okay, now I'm sure some listeners are wondering, what happens if they miss that ideal repotting window? Is it a disaster for the bonsai?
Don't panic. While it's always best to aim for those ideal times, there's often some flexibility depending on your climate and the specific needs of your tree.
Okay.
Those ideal repotting windows, they're a good guideline, but it's more important to prioritize the well-being of your tree over a rigid schedule. If a late frost threatens your early spring repotting plans, you're better off just waiting a few extra weeks until the conditions are more favorable. But if you do find yourself repotting outside of that prime window, it's crucial to be extra attentive to your bonsai's needs during its recovery.
Okay, so what does that extra TLC look like?
It's all about observation and providing a supportive environment. So, monitor your bonsai closely for any signs of stress, like wilting leaves or slowed growth. Pay close attention to your watering, making sure that the soil stays consistently moist but not waterlogged. And consider keeping your bonsai in a sheltered location, protected from harsh sunlight or wind or extreme temperatures.
Now, I have to ask, even though we're talking about when not to repot, isn't repotting generally considered a good thing?
A lot of bonsai enthusiasts fall into the trap of over-repotting, thinking they're doing their trees a favor. But each repotting disrupts the root system and forces the tree to spend precious energy establishing new roots. It can weaken the tree and make it more susceptible to pests and diseases.
Oh, okay.
So only repot when the tree truly needs it.
So we've talked about when to avoid repotting. Is there a gentler approach than a full repot?
There is, you bet. There's a technique called slip potting,
Okay.
which is much less invasive than a full repot. Instead of taking the tree out of the pot and pruning the roots, you simply move the entire root ball to a slightly larger pot. It should be slightly larger than the one your tree is currently in, maybe about an inch or so wider in diameter, backfill with more soil, and gently secure it in place.
It sounds like a great option when you just want to give your bonsai a little more room to grow without the shock of a full repot. But when is it the right choice?
Well, let's start with young trees. You know, those vigorous ones that are just growing like crazy. Their roots fill up their pots so quickly, and slip potting just gives them that extra room they need to keep going strong without the shock of root pruning. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have your delicate trees, the ones that are recovering from some kind of illness, or maybe they're just a bit sensitive.
More fragile, yeah.
Right. Well, slip potting is a real lifesaver for these guys because it minimizes any disruption to their root systems, giving them a better chance to bounce back.
But what about those times when you need to repot outside of the usual springtime window?
Ah, yes. That's another time when slip potting really shines.
Like if you inherit a bonsai or, heaven forbid, the original pot breaks.
Exactly. Slip potting is like a safety net during those, less than ideal times. It really reduces the risk of transplant shock. And, there are some other interesting techniques out there too. Things like partial repotting.
Partial repotting. I've never heard of that one. What is that
Well,
exactly?
it's another way to deal with a root-bound bonsai without doing a full repot. Instead of taking out the whole root ball, you just remove a portion of it and replace it with fresh soil.
Interesting.
It can be a good option for trees that are, really sensitive to root disturbance or for really old, fragile trees.
So more of a targeted approach.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, well, we've covered a lot here. We've learned about, when a bonsai needs to be repotted, the ideal times, and the specific needs of different bonsai species.
For sure.
To these more advanced techniques.
Hmm.
What's next on our repotting journey?
Well, now that we know when to repot, let's look into the actual process itself.
Can you walk us through the process of repotting a bonsai?
Sure. Well, the first thing you want to do is gather your tools.
Wow.
You'll need a root hook,
Uh-huh.
some sharp shears for pruning, a chopstick or something similar for working the soil, and a watering can. The root hook. This tool is really crucial for gently unraveling the roots of your bonsai without causing any damage. It's like a miniature rake. Next, we have chopsticks.
You'll use these to work the soil around the roots.
The slender shape allows you to maneuver them delicately around the roots
Yeah.
and ensure even distribution of the soil.
Perfect.
And of course, we'll need root shears. Sharp, clean cuts made with specialized bonsai shears promote faster healing
Right.
and minimize the risk of disease. And last but not least, you'll need a watering can. A fine rose ensures that the water is distributed evenly and gently, preventing soil erosion and root disturbance.
Okay, so we've got our tools. Let's move on to the other essential elements. The soil in the pot. Now, we've already selected the perfect soil and pot for our bonsai in previous deep dives. But it's worth reminding our listeners to have their chosen soil mix
Yes.
ready to go.
Good point. Whether it's akadama or a fired clay mix or something else, make sure it provides the right balance of water retention and drainage.
Right.
Having it prepped and easily accessible will streamline the repotting process.
And of course, our pre-selected bonsai pot should be ready for its new inhabitant.
Yes.
But are there any specific preparations we need to make to the pot itself before we begin?
Yes, there are a couple of key things.
Okay.
First, you want to place a small piece of drainage mesh over the drainage hole
Okay.
at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
This prevents soil from escaping and ensures good drainage. And the other important element is tie-down wires. These are essential for securing your bonsai in the pot, ensuring stability as it gets established.
So before we even think about repotting, we need our root hook, chopsticks, root shears, watering can, the appropriate soil mix, and our prepped pot with the drainage mesh and tie-down wires.
Having all these elements ready to go will not only make the process more efficient,
Right.
but also allow you to focus on the task at hand,
Right.
which is giving your bonsai the best possible care.
Right. So we've got the tree and our tools and we got our pot. Now, how do we actually get the bonsai out of this old pot?
Gently is the key. Use a root hook or even a chopstick to loosen the soil around the edges,
Okay.
and then tilt the pot and try to slide the tree out.
What if it's really stuck in there?
Sometimes you have to tap the bottom of the pot.
Okay.
If it's really stubborn, you can try running a thin knife around the inside edge.
Okay, so we've got the tree out. What's next?
We need to examine the root ball to get it ready for pruning.
All right, so what's the goal with root pruning?
It may seem counterintuitive, but root pruning keeps your bonsai healthy and helps with shaping. By trimming back some of the roots, we encourage those new, finer roots to grow, the ones that are great at absorbing water and nutrients. And to do that, you're going to use that root hook.
Right.
Gently comb through them,
Right.
loosening any that are circling or matted. You want to be as gentle as possible to avoid damaging those fine roots.
Okay.
Prune away any dead or damaged roots or any that are overly thick or those circling roots.
Those are the ones we prune with our root shears, right?
Exactly. Remember, clean cuts are essential for the tree's health and healing.
But how much can we prune without harming the tree?
A good rule of thumb is to remove about 1/3 of the overall root mass.
Okay.
This encourages new growth
Right.
and ensures the tree fits comfortably in its new pot.
Okay, so we've prepped the tree and we've pruned the roots. Now what?
Let's turn our attention to the new pot. And those tie-down wires we talked about?
How do we use those?
First, thread the wires through the drainage holes in the pot. Then you add a layer of fresh bonsai soil.
Okay, so we've got our layer of bonsai soil in the pot. What's next?
Okay, so now you're going to make a little mound of soil
Okay.
right where the base of the trunk is going to be.
So you're not putting the tree flat on the bottom of the pot.
Right, you want it a little bit higher up.
Okay, so I've got my tree positioned on my little mound of soil. Now what?
This is where you can get creative.
So this is where the art comes in. So we have to choose the right angle and position
Yeah, you want to showcase the tree's best features.
and create a sense of balance.
We usually position the tree a little off-center in the pot.
Off-center. Why? Wouldn't it look better right in the middle?
Bonsai is all about asymmetry, remember? Putting it off-center creates visual interest, and it's more like how trees grow in nature. You can experiment with different angles
Right.
to achieve the desired visual impact. Want a more dramatic windswept look? Tilt the tree slightly forward.
And for a calmer, more serene feel.
A more upright position,
Hmm.
perhaps with a slight lean to one side.
Okay,
Play around until you find what speaks to you.
got it.
Once you're happy with the position,
Mm-hmm.
we use those wires we threaded earlier to secure the tree. We wrap them gently around the base of the trunk, making sure they're snug but not too tight. Now, with the tree secure, we start filling in the rest of the pot with our soil mix. We use a tool, like a chopstick, to gently work the soil around the roots, making sure there are no air pockets. We want good contact between the roots and the soil, so the tree is stable and can absorb water well. Keep adding soil and working it in
Okay.
until you reach just below the rim of the pot.
So the tree is planted, secured, nestled in. What's the final step in this whole process?
The final step is to give your bonsai a good watering. Grab your gentle watering can with the fine rose
Right.
and thoroughly soak the soil until water runs out of the drainage holes.
Okay.
This settles the soil
Mm-hmm.
and ensures the roots are hydrated.
And once we've watered it, what's next?
Now that the repotting is done,
Yeah.
it's important to provide the right aftercare
Oh, okay.
to help your bonsai recover and thrive in its new home. Aftercare is just as crucial as the repotting process itself. The repotting process can be a bit stressful for the tree,
Right.
so you want to minimize any additional stress.
Okay. What are some of the key things that we need to keep in mind?
So first, you'll want to protect your repotted bonsai from direct sunlight and strong winds for a few weeks. You'll want to place the repotted bonsai in a sheltered spot out of direct sunlight. This will help it recover from the repotting process and adjust to its new environment. Now, even though we already watered the tree thoroughly,
Mm-hmm.
you need to keep a close eye on the soil moisture
Okay.
and water the bonsai whenever the soil surface feels dry to the touch. And be careful not to overwater.
Okay.
Remember, the roots are still adjusting to
yeah.
their new environment.
Okay. Speaking of adjusting, what about fertilizer?
It's best to hold off on fertilizing for a few weeks after repotting.
Okay.
The fresh soil already has nutrients,
Right.
and you don't want to overwhelm the roots while they're recovering.
What about pruning?
You can do some light trimming
Okay.
to remove any damaged or crossing branches,
Mm-hmm.
but avoid any major pruning for a few months.
Again, just letting it recover.
Exactly.
And what about pests and diseases?
Yeah.
Should we be on high alert after repotting?
It's wise to keep a close eye out for any signs of pests or diseases.
Okay.
The stress of repotting can sometimes weaken a tree's defenses.
Okay, so we talk about protecting it from the elements,
Mm-hmm.
watering, fertilizer, pruning,
Right.
pest control.
Yep.
Is there anything else that we should really be aware of during the aftercare phase?
The most important thing is patience. It takes time for a bonsai to fully recover
Yeah.
and start thriving in its new pot.
Right.
Just provide the basic care we've discussed and allow the bonsai to do its thing.
Awesome. Well, I feel like we've covered
Yeah.
all the essential steps in repotting and aftercare.
I think so. And like with anything, practice makes perfect. The more you repot, the more comfortable and confident you'll become.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Until next time, happy bonsaiing, everyone.